Hi there. Welcome to this latest online video lesson intended to provide you important principles for argumentation, study, and practice. Today we're going to look at perspectives of argument, and the primary points we're going to cover in this lesson involve what does it mean to say there are different perspectives for argument, and why is this idea important. And then we'll take a look at the three primary perspectives of argument that argumentation scholars recognize: the dialectical perspective, the logical perspective, and the rhetorical perspective. But first, we need to ask the basic question: what are these things and why do they matter? The theory of argument perspectives comes from Dr. Joseph Wenzel, professor emeritus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a great scholar of argumentation who just happened to be the advisor for my master's degree when I was a U of I grad student. I remember playing volleyball with him. Really great guy. Anyway, a perspective is a different way of perceiving something. So when we're talking about argument perspectives, we're talking about different ways of perceiving what an argument is. Think about the metaphor of a house, and that house has lots of windows. If you look in one window, you'll get a great view of the living room, and you might see some other rooms indirectly connected to it, but you won't see them quite as clearly. You look in another window, you'll see the dining room and maybe a little bit of the kitchen, but you might not see the living room at all. You take a look at another window and you'll see the bedroom, maybe a little bit of the master bath. You could see the door leading to the living room, but you wouldn't see the living room so much. And then you might look in the window of the creepy attic and wonder, why are those decrepit old ventriloquist dummies in there? Anyway, the idea is if you look in the window of a house, you're going to see some parts of that house really up close and personal. Other parts of the house you'll see indirectly, and you might see how they're connected. And there might be other parts of the house that you don't see at all. Well, the same is true if you think about the field of argumentation as a house. There are at least three major windows that you can look through to see different points of view regarding how to understand argument. One window provides access to the dialectical perspective, another window provides us access to the logical perspective, and a third window provides us access to the rhetorical perspective. And each of these points of view emphasizes certain ideas about argument, ways to think about it, ways to consider how we handle specific arguments, either as an arguer ourselves or an audience member or a critic and evaluator of argument. So let's take a look at each one and see what they bring to the table to help us understand argumentation more fully. The first perspective is called the dialectical perspective. Dialectic is an approach to truth-seeking that goes all the way back to the philosophy of ancient Greece. It's a procedural seeking of truth via examining differing points of view through discourse. You can think about it in terms of the testing of ideas against each other in a debate, and the quintessential approach to dialectic that arose in ancient Greek philosophy were the conversations that were depicted in the dialogues written by Plato, where Socrates would question and cross-examine different folks as they tried to determine together the meaning of concepts like love or the good life. It's really more of a discussion than a debate, though. The idea is you're not looking for one winner and one loser, but everyone is collectively trying to figure out what the truth is. So the dialectical perspective, according to ancient Tudor, focuses on and enhances a candid, critical, and comprehensive examination of all positions relevant to the topic. We want to be able to examine all the positions because ultimately we want to try to figure out what is the best decision. Somewhere in all of these competing ideas is the most true option. And so we're going to be concerned about whether or not that examination is candid. Is it free and open? Does everybody have access to participate in the argument and to hear the arguments? Is the examination critical? Are we using standards and criteria to determine what a good decision versus a poor decision is? Is the examination comprehensive? Are we including as many important variables as possible? And are the positions we're looking at relevant to the topic, or are they not relevant to the discussion and maybe we need to not think about them as much? A good way to think about the dialectical perspective in practice might be to consider what the leader of a formal meeting does, for instance, the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives in our Congress. What meetings often do is provide procedural rules and guidelines to determine what we're going to talk about, how long we'll spend talking about it, who gets to speak when, how long they get to speak, and rules for handing off the turn taking from one speaker to another speaker. The idea is we have these procedural rules to be as fair and regulated as possible, to make sure that the debate and discussion will lead us to ultimately making a good decision by having everything heard in a very clear way. So when we think about the dialectical perspective, Dr. Wenzel wants us to look at argument as a procedure for truth finding. And the key questions we're going to ask about these procedures involve: one, how do we assess the issues? In other words, what are the important ideas we need to think about in this context? Secondly, what are the primary issues and assumptions involved? In other words, what sorts of points or topics do we need to consider, and what sort of truths do we hold in common going into this discussion that are going to help us with our decision making? And finally, what are the most important considerations? If we're going to make a decision, are there standards or criteria or certain values that are more important than others? So, for instance, think about these kinds of examples that illustrate dimensions of the dialectical perspective. Robert's Rules of Order that regulates how meetings are conducted. Criminal and civil procedure laws that dictate how lawyers can communicate in the courtroom and how judges and juries can make decisions. Rules for debates that regulate how long each speaker gets to speak and how long they get to respond to somebody who attacks them. Value hierarchies, systems where we determine what values should we prioritize over other values if we're going to make a decision. And other kinds of decision-making criteria that determine that if we've got two alternatives to choose from, the one that meets the criteria we go with, and if anything doesn't meet the criteria, we don't go with that in our decision. So that's the dialectical perspective, a procedural approach to trying to understand and discover the truth. The second perspective we need to think about is the logical perspective. Logic, like dialectic, has its seeds in the philosophy of classical Greece. Logic is essentially the reasonability, rationality, validity, or soundness of an argument. In other words, is this argument put together in a way that leads us to a conclusion that makes sense? So we're especially interested in the function of evidence and reasoning in the argument in order to establish the truth and determining whether the conclusion or the claim being reached is a true conclusion or a faulty conclusion. So the logical perspective emphasizes the accuracy of the premises and the correctness of the inferences linking premises and evidence to the claims they support. So in other words, note the emphasis on accuracy and correctness. Is this argument correctly put together so that it's leading us to an accurate conclusion? And so we'll be especially emphasizing the way that we look at premises. Premises are essentially points that form the foundation for the claims or conclusions we're going to make. So pieces of evidence or assumptions that everybody agrees is true, and then these assumptions about what is true can be used to build to other conclusions. And when we're talking about inferences, we're talking about the reasoning. We're talking about the connections between premises and evidence to claims. So how do we get from the evidence that we can agree with to the claim that we might not otherwise agree with? So you can think about the logical perspective from the standpoint of somebody who's being asked to accept an argument, and we're trying to figure out if it's true or not. So as we try to put together a puzzle, for instance, we have to see whether or not the pieces fit together in the right way, because if the pieces don't fit together in the right way, we're not going to get the correct picture. So Wenzel would have us look at argument from the logical perspective as a product to be analyzed and evaluated. And the key questions we ask to evaluate argument as a product are: is the evidence correct? And does the inference or reasoning justify the conclusion or the claim? Do the puzzle pieces fit together in such a way that lead us to a correct picture? So examples of the kinds of things that illustrate the logical perspective include the symbolic logic that philosophers use and sometimes also gets used for proofs in geometry, if you had that in high school sophomore math class. The Toulmin method for diagramming arguments to analyze and evaluate them. Tests of reasoning to determine if the links between evidence and claim are logical. Tests of evidence to determine the quality of the supporting information and whether or not it's valid and reasonable. and the study of fallacies, mistakes and errors in argument that might sound logical but really aren't. So the logical perspective is about examining and evaluating arguments as a product to see if it's true and correct. The final perspective is the rhetorical perspective. Rhetoric, just like argument and dialectic, has its seeds in the practices of teachers and philosophers in classical Greece. And rhetoric, according to Aristotle, is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So the rhetorical perspective, according to Inch and Tudor, has us look at arguments as appeals to an audience, and we think about these appeals in terms of persuasion, in terms of influence. We must take account of the circumstances in which the argument was made. In other words, as Aristotle would put it, in any given case. Arguments are put out there in different circumstances, under different contexts. And so we have to understand something is going to be more or less persuasive based on the circumstances within which it was constructed. And we also need to pay attention to the strategies that are used to influence the argument's audience. So when we're thinking about rhetoric, we need to think about strategic communication. Consider, for instance, the classic I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There are a lot of different ways you can think about his speech as an argument intended as a piece of rhetorical persuasion. You can look at the argument that he makes from a historical basis concerning the foundation of freedom regardless of race that was established all the way back in the times of the Founding Fathers and of Abraham Lincoln. You can look at the way that he uses language and style to paint very vivid word pictures to move his audience's emotions. So Wenzel would have us look at argument from a rhetorical perspective as a process of persuasive communication, a dynamic interplay between a speaker, a message, an audience, and the context that surrounds them all. So the key questions we would ask from this perspective is, how do we understand the arguments? And in this case, it would be such things as, how do we understand the logical construction of the argument, which we see there's some overlap with the logical perspective, but we're also going to look at other elements of how the arguments are put together to be persuasive. And in order to figure that out, the other question we want to ask is, how do we understand the audience? Who are they? What are they bringing to the table? And then we can determine to what extent are the appeals present in the argument going to be more or less influential for that audience. So certain examples that illustrate the kinds of things we can look at from the rhetorical perspective include examining the situational context, audience analysis that an arguer might conduct to determine who their listener is and what might be used to influence them, the actual construction of arguments in terms of logic and soundness of reasoning, appeals to source credibility and character, getting the audience to trust the speaker so that the speaker's arguments will be given more credence, emotional appeals that are directed at the feelings and the senses of the audience, and elements such as language, style, and delivery that all play important parts in whether or not an audience will be influenced. And so that's the rhetorical perspective, looking at argument in terms of a dynamic process of persuasive communication. So, to sum things up, we've gotten a sense of the notion of perspectives as involving different frames for understanding and practice. And we've talked about the three primary perspectives of argument: the dialectical perspective, the logical perspective, and the rhetorical perspective. To sum up one more time with our house metaphor, if we think about argumentation as an entire field, as a house, we can think about those perspectives as looking through the house from different windows. In the window of the dialectical perspective, we're thinking about argument as a procedure for truth finding, and the primary question we want to ask is, has the argument been sufficiently explored? If we look through the window of the logical perspective, we think about the argument as a rational product, and the primary question we want to ask ourselves is the argument sound? And finally, if we look through the window of the rhetorical perspective, we think about argument as a process of persuasive communication, and we ask ourselves the primary question, are the recipients likely to be persuaded? If you have any questions about this stuff, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.